Welcome to the Lab/No Big Deal podcast. I'm your host, Joshua Diaz, and joined again is author Gary Meece. Gary's the author of 3 books on the West Memphis 3, Blood on Black, Where the Monsters Go, and a condensed version of the 2, The Case Against the West Memphis 3 Killers. Gary, how are you doing today?
I'm good.
Good to have you. And we've been following this case. You've been following this case since at least 2011, but you've been aware of it for some time. I started following this case around 2015, earlier than that, probably right around the time of the release, but didn't get really deep into it until a few years later. And I became a fan of yours from your books and your podcast, and you have a podcast on YouTube called The Case Against. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And it basically just goes over this case of the West Memphis 3, and in case people don't know what that is, who the West Memphis 3 are, or the backstory, it is the case of 3 little boys murdered is that 92? I believe, May 5th, 1992.
Oh, it's 93.
93, May 5th, 1993. And Stevie Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore were found brutally murdered in a ditch bank in Robin Hood Hills in West Memphis, Arkansas. 3 men convicted at the time: Damien Echols, Jesse Miskelly, Jason Baldwin. And this case really took a big turn when HBO got involved, showed up with their cameras, and it's been nothing but chaos since. Would you agree, Gary?
And it just gets more chaotic all the time.
Yeah,
it really does.
And this case is how many years old now?
28 years. 28
years. And it still has legs.
Going on 29, actually. It'll be 29 years this year. So.
And isn't it amazing that it's still around and we're still talking about it, and it just doesn't go away? And this case has 3 convicted people. We're talking about confessed convicted people. But yet, here we are again. Gary, I have been paying attention loosely, not as much as you have, or other people that are, and I am very invested in this case. I always have been. But every time I see this kind of stuff come up, I kind of roll my eyes at it, because I always feel that there's nothing new to see when the money starts to dry, when it comes to donations and things like that, especially for Damien Echols, the suspected ringleader of the West Memphis 3. I see a publicity stunt, and I very rarely give it any attention. But this thing, unfortunately, has gotten some legs in the media, whether it's right or wrong, and I do believe that it's wrong. How do you say?
Well, that's true, and I read articles, and I let me say, one of the prime source, I was going to talk to you, we were talking about this a little bit before, but one of the prime sources in all this media coverage is a lot of things has been Mara Leverett, who wrote the book Devil's Knot about the case, and tried to blame somebody. She implicated John Mark Byers, who was the adopted father of Christopher Byers, as she sort of painted him as the real killer, and of course he had a really good alibi, so she just sort of ignored that for chapter after chapter about him. But anyway, what she has done, and then she's done this throughout her career on this particular case, is she's simply channeled whatever the defense lawyers wanted out in the public and put it out there as news. What happened was, it's such a quagmire. I could use another term, but I won't do it. But anyway, what had happened was,
it's okay, Gary. I've already lost a sponsor. Go ahead and say shit show. It's fine.
well, one of those. It was one of those cluster things. But
Yeah,
anyway,
sure.
it's there's an Arkansas lawyer who was a bit involved. Actually, this what had happened was 2 years ago, a little bit under 2 years ago, coming up on 2 years ago. Bob Ruff had, I think, it depended on how you packaged it, but he had 4 hours on the Oxygen Channel about the West Memphis Three, and it was a big bunch of nothing. But one of the things he pulled out was this idea that DNA testing would really solve this case as if it's not already solved, and that there was what he called a new technique called MVAC, which is based in this firm out in California that would be able to, by using a liquid or extraction method, get better DNA sampling than they'd had back in '93, or even when they were retesting the DNA back in started in 2007, pretty much. I mean, it started a little earlier, but they got some results in 2007, and then there was further retesting up until preparation for an evidentiary hearing that they were going to have in Arkansas for the West Memphis Three, the three men, the killers. That was coming up in December 2011.
Convicted killers.
Well, they were convicted. One of them has outright confessed. I don't know how many times you want to count, but
we counted 7, at least 7 full, and then many other partials.
Yeah. And anyway, they were going to go to. They had gotten, because partially because West Memphis Three supporters had put so much pressure on the state, they had rejiggered the state's DNA laws to allow retesting if there was some reason to do so, and the West Memphis Three had gotten some initial approval, and they'd done some testing, and they really didn't come up with a whole lot, but they came up with what they posit as kind of a smoking gun on the stepfather of one of the other boys, Gary Hobbs, based on the fact that there was a hair that had a bit of mitochondrial DNA that could be a match to him and could be a match to literally millions of other people in the United States and hundreds of people in West Memphis, Arkansas, which is where he lived. And so they went from blaming John Mark Byers to blaming Gary Hobbs. And so that's the favorite alternative suspect for some years now. And on that basis, they pushed on and with the courts, and they were going to get an evidentiary hearing in 2011. As it came close to the deadline, they really had not come up with much in terms of DNA testing. And so they they wrangled out a deal with the state. It was the defense's idea that they would take what is known as an Alford plea, which is a guilty plea. By every legal standard, you are pleading guilty. However, you can say that you're innocent, but I'm pleading guilty, based on the idea that, if I were retried, that the state had sufficient evidence to convict me again. That is what they said. But they pled guilty. And they were released on this basis. They'd spent 18 years in prison. And then nothing's been done at all in the case they were on probation for 10 years. Well, we get to just a few, so August of this August, they were going to be going off probation. Well, as we got very close to the end of this probationary period, they started making more noise about retesting on the basis of what Bob Ruff had said. But these three guys that were convicted, they hadn't made move one for 10 years to do anything about reinvestigating this case, finding the so-called real killer, or doing anything else, even though they'd promised when they told the media when they were released that this was going to be one of their prime objectives. They didn't do anything like that and hadn't done anything like that in years. David Echols is mostly practicing ceremonial magic with little professed interest in the case most of the time, up until very recently. But Bob Ruff chased them all down. He literally banged on a bedroom door with Jesse Miskelly Jr. and shouted through the door about whether Jesse would approve retesting, and Jesse goes, "Oh, okay." I don't know exactly what he said, but it was pretty much like, "Yeah, sure."
Well, he wouldn't let him in his house. He didn't want to talk to him, and he said he had a toothache.
Yeah.
While Bob yells through a screen door, "Is it okay if we retest some stuff?" And you hear Jesse go.
Jesse was in there.
Jesse was in there with
his girlfriend, so who knows what was going on.
Yeah.
But anyway, toothache. He probably did have a toothache.
He said he did. He said that was. I remember going that because toothaches suck, Bob. Like, go away.
Yeah, and the other two guys went along with it, but it wasn't their idea, and they didn't seem that enthused about it. It was more like, yeah, okay, yeah. So the support, and then Bob got his army of basement dwelling investigators to pressure the prosecuting attorney in Jonesboro, Arkansas, who has jurisdiction over the Crittenden County where this crime occurred. In Arkansas, it's in Arkansas. West Memphis is in Arkansas, and it's across the river from Memphis, where I lived for almost 40 years. And I worked. By the way, I was working at the main newspaper in Memphis at the time that these murders occurred. 7 or 8 miles from where I was sat most of the day. And so I was very familiar with the case. Unlike, I will say, sometimes people say, "Oh, you covered the case at the time." I didn't go to the trial. Mm-hmm. I had other duties at the newspaper. I did not cover the trial.
But
I read about them. I talked about them with the editors and reporters who covered them, and I was very aware at the time of the case.
Can I say something? I want to say something as to, because you and I have had conversations about this before, Gary, and you are not a true crime guy. That's not your thing. You could care less about quote unquote true crime. And what you did was you covered these stories, not just this kind of a story. You covered these kinds of stories all the time. Not that there's a story quite like this one, which is what obviously piqued your interest, but you dealt with these crime stories constantly. Is that true?
Yeah, more or less. There were times when I worked in like suburban coverage for quite a while, where I was an editor in the suburban editions, and basically we were just covering city council meetings, and let me say I worked as a reporter dating back well over 45 years now, for several years. I did a lot of reporting when I was working after I retired from the commercial appeal. A couple of years later, I worked for about 4 years at the West Memphis newspaper, which is where my interest really peaked about this case, and I covered a lot of crime there. And there's a lot of crime. There's a lot of crime in West Memphis, and there's a lot of crime in Memphis. Both of them are crime hotbeds. But I saw stuff I've done stuff on the street. I've talked to cops a zillion times and all that. But I was not a cop reporter or anything like that for most of my career, not at all. So I don't pretend that I have that kind of status. Status is what it is. I'm just not that. But I've been a reporter quite a bit, so it's not like I never did any of that.
Right, but you're not. Like I said, you were a reporter. That was your job. This wasn't exactly a hobby or anything. This is what you did for a living. You covered these kinds of cases, and like you said, West Memphis was a hot spot for criminal activity, whether it be petty or whether it be homicide. And that was just kind of your thing, because you've expressed to me very much before that you're more into the wrongful conviction movement. Is that what you would call it?
I think so. I mean, yeah, I would call it that. That is, a broader movement that goes well beyond true crime. People point to the Innocence Project, for instance, as an example of an organization that was formed to get criminals off, criminals who were wrongfully convicted, get their sentences, get relief from their sentences on the basis that they started out as DNA testing, and they've sort of devolved from that to something less than that now. But they're big, they get a lot of money and they get a lot of support, and they've got the name, so they use it, and they're really abusing that now. I mean, they got Steve Avery on their list of wrongful convictions, and that's a joke. So, I'm not even going to get to this Avery case, but it's obvious the guy's guilty.
And we're not interested in arguing with you people about it either.
And I've read the crackpot theories about it, and I read some of them. There's so many of them that it's incredible. It's moved beyond just the facts of the case into all sorts of really bizarre stuff. More so in some ways than the West Memphis 3 case, but though, you can get some people who are with some pretty off the wall theories about the West Memphis 3 case as well. So what happened was, because Bob Ruff had brought this up, there started to be talks between the prosecuting attorney, who at the time was Scott Ellington, who had agreed to this plea deal back in 2011. Got a lot of criticism for it, and we could discuss why he did that, but he had what he saw as good reasons for working out a deal with them, and a lot of it just simply had to do with the fact he didn't want to try an 18-year-old case that he had no personal investment in, and there was some potential liability for the court if they weren't able to reconvict. But it went beyond that into some politics and some other stuff I'm not going to get into right now. But Binka was involved back then with all that. Anyway, Binka tries to get, he's got this idea that he's going to be getting this evidence from, Bob Ruff seemed to have this idea he could just show up at Scott Ellington's office, and Ellington would just hand the evidence over to him, and then Bob would ship it off to this lab in California, and bingo, the West Memphis 3 would be proven innocent. Well, that isn't how the system works. But they did think of this defense lawyer involved. He had discussions for quite a while with Scott Ellington. Ellington sort of led him on that, oh yeah, I'm okay with retesting, but he never did anything. And then a story I read today from I was rereading today from Mar Lever right before we started talking, was talking about these conversations and how they had this idea that this was just a fait accompli, that they were going to get this stuff retested. Well, it didn't happen. And Ellington basically just weaseled out of it. The guy's kind of a weasel, and he just weaseled out of the whole deal. He was named a judge. They've got a new prosecuting attorney in place now, Keith Cressman. And that whatever dealings that went on between Binka and Ellington sort of went away to a certain extent, but they kept pushing for retesting, and then they tried to get some information from the West Memphis police. Oh, well, there was this conversations back and forth between the prosecuting attorney and this defense attorney, and at some point, the prosecuting attorney tells the defense attorney that his understanding was some of the evidence was lost or destroyed. And, there's this little firestorm in the West Memphis 3 world that blew up, over this. Oh, and you can imagine the conspiracy theories that went on with this. Oh, they're destroying the West Memphis 3 evidence. They didn't have this evidence back when these 3 pleaded guilty. Damien Echols was making noises about how he was going to prove that he was defrauded, and his dealings with the system back in 2011, because they didn't even have any evidence against him then, and it was an invalid invalid plea on that basis, and he was going to sue the state and all that. And so this went on for a while, and there never was any clarification on the status of the evidence from the West Memphis Police Department. Binka starts filing Freedom of Information Act uh, motion or actions, letters, and so forth to the West Memphis Police Department. Basically, they just stonewall him. So this goes on a bit, and then the West Memphis mayor chimes in over the summer and says, "Oh, I understand that a lot of it was burned up in a fire." Oh, well, this real back, 10 years before. I think he said it was in 2006, which was 5 years before the guilty plea. And so this just fed that firestorm even higher and higher, and conspiracy theories were popping up everywhere, and this went on and on and on and on, and then tomorrow, so they, Binka files over the summer, files motions in court, which nothing had been done in court in this case in years, and they're really not they don't have any grounds for being able to file anything in this case, the three killers, because they signed away their rights in 2011 to take any further legal action in the case. However, the fact that the evidence may have been missing opened the door to that just enough so that they could do something with that. They could try to find a way to sort of squeeze back in through that crack and get the case reopened. It's a closed case. And so what happens is there's, the West Memphis Police Department continues to stonewall Patrick Binka for months and months and months and months. And then Morrow Everett starts reporting a couple of months ago that there's a court order that's supposed to produce. And and he wasn't really even, at this point, he wasn't asking for the evidence itself. All he was asking for all he really could ask for was the records about how the evidence was held, where it was stored, if there was a fire. Well, it turns out there was a fire. It was in 2016. And it was in a container where they were storing records. There were some West Memphis 3 records in that container. They weren't destroyed at the fire. One of the boxes containing some West Memphis 3 evidence was removed from the container, and it was found in a field about 100 yards away. I think it was 100 feet actually. And there's no explanation as to why they removed that particular box or why they left it. We do know that some guns were taken out of that container, and it was probably it's almost certainly an arson fire. But we had, they did an investigation. They couldn't find anything about who might have done it. Perhaps the guns will pop up at some point. But, to me, it seems likely they were just in there looking for guns, drugs, and some other things, and somebody happened to see a box of West Memphis 3 evidence and decided to take it out, but they just decided not to take it very far. I don't really understand that.
But it wasn't destroyed, correct?
No, it was not destroyed.
So it just not sure why it ended up there, but nothing happened to it.
No, nothing happened to it except it got moved from one place to another. So this goes on, and finally, I haven't even tried to get the exact dates on this, but very recently, within the last month or so, Binka finally worked, instead of Morrow Everett claiming that there's a court order demanding all this information from the West Memphis 3, there wasn't. Binka filed a summons with the court that apparently was never even served, which is, it's a fairly standard legal thing, that a lawyer would seek a summons to the courts, but without the power of a court behind it, there's really, it doesn't really have a whole lot of power. And on top of that, it was never served, which means if it's never served, it's just simply not valid as far as the West Memphis Police Department having to worry about it. So, but they had discussions apparently, and so the West Memphis Police Department agreed to let Binka look at the evidence. So he goes in and he looks at the evidence and comes out and says, "Oh, it's all intact. It's complete. It's well cataloged. Not a problem." Now, where all where the story came from, some of the evidence was lost or destroyed, I don't know. There were two.
I have an idea, Gary.
Well, I have an idea too. But what's your idea?
Does it rhyme with Schmamey and Schmeckles?
Yeah, I think so. But there's some sort of media manipulation going on with this, and of course Damien is eating this up, and he's actually paying attention to developments. Not that there's any real developments in the case. He's actually paying attention to the case for a change instead of posting stuff about Kabbalah and ceremonial magic and so forth. And so the West Memphis police reporters, after this whole time of going, "Oh yay, there's no evidence is missing. We're going to get this case reopened, and Damien's going to get all three of them really. All three of them are going to get the walk. They're going to be exonerated because they really didn't have any evidence back in 2011. Now they're all cheering because, oh yeah, the evidence is now it's available for retesting. Well, the big problem is the West Memphis 3 defense, and I did not look this afternoon, but I think I looked as recently as yesterday. It's not filed anything seeking retesting of the evidence. Keith Pressman, who's the prosecuting attorney, has said that without this formal action that the lawyers need to take, where they file something with the courts about seeking retesting the evidence, he's not going to take any legal action on the evidence and the evidence getting having anything done to it, or really just continue the status it's had since the cases ended. The trials ended in 1994.
There's no reason for
he's
him
not
to
doing
that.
The West Memphis Police Department has still been mum on this, but they did allow Pressman to look at the evidence. They still haven't issued any sort of public statement on this at all. But they don't have the legal right to just hand over evidence to anybody. That's not in their purview at all. It really has to go through the court. And they haven't filed anything with the court. Until they file something with the court, I don't really see a means by which the evidence can be retested unless the prosecuting attorney takes it upon himself to say that there's some new evidence, there's some really overriding, powerful reason why this evidence needs to be retested. There is no new evidence. There hasn't been anything happening in this case except noise for at least 10 years, really longer than that, except for the release, but 10 years. They did do the retesting back in 2011. That was a real thing that really happened. And the results were really inconclusive. They found some little, the boys were put in a ditch. They were kept there. They were left there. They were stripped of their clothes, and they were put in a nasty little ditch, drainage ditch, in these woods in West Memphis, Arkansas, and they stayed there for 18 hours. Chances are you're not going to get a whole lot of DNA evidence when the sources of the DNA evidence went through those kind of conditions.
Who retested in 2011?
Huh?
Who had what? Who?
Bode Laboratories. BODE. I think it's pronounced Bode. It may be Bodie. But
was
Bode.
it at the request of who?
By order of the court. With the defense was requesting it, but it was court ordered.
Is that the evidence that Lori Davis, the testing that said she lost?
She said she can't find the results of the retesting at the time to say what the results were.
Because you said, and I just want to clarify here, because you said that it was inconclusive, the testing. But do we actually know if it was inconclusive or if that's just what they said?
There was a preliminary report filed with the court, which is by no means complete, and it came from the defense attorneys. I don't think they would be brazen enough to simply lie to the courts, but there was, and I think it was filed, a preliminary report filed, I think in July, which was a month or so before the release, and they had to actually produce the actual reports very shortly after that, within days of the releases. I don't know the exact day, but it was very shortly after that. They had a deadline. It was put up or shut up. You're either going to show us something or we're not going to go forward with the evidentiary here. You have to give the prosecution time to look at the evidence. And it was going to be evidence at a evidentiary hearing in December, so you have to give several months to the prosecution to look at that. Rather than produce the actual records, they decided to take the guilty plea. However, in a preliminary report, they said, they found little bits and pieces of DNA, but they couldn't link it to anybody, and it didn't match up anybody that was a figure in the case. And frankly, there's been a lot of potential for contamination over the last 28 years. Or at that time, it wasn't 28, it was 18 years. The last 18, 19 years, there's a lot of potential for contamination. And also these boys were living in the real world. They very easily could have picked up DNA samples from schoolmates, from each other, from casual acquaintances, from parents, all sorts of things. There was some, animal hairs that were found. There's some hairs of various sorts that were found at that scene, but they haven't been, with the exception of the Hobbs, the so-called Hobbs hair, which cannot be definitively linked to Terry Hobbs, and another hair based on mitochondrial DNA that was found not at the scene, but in the woods. It was on a tree stump or something that matched the mitochondrial DNA of a friend of Terry Hobbs named David Jacoby, who did help him search for the boys that day. But those are two very, very, very weak pieces of evidence. You couldn't base an arrest on that.
Speaking of David Jacoby, I have heard rumors over and over that his hair was out there too. Have you heard that one?
Well, that's what I'm saying right now. You hear the same thing. Terry Hobbs' hair was found, and David Jacoby's hair was found. Now, Terry Hobbs' hair was supposedly found in one of the shoelaces that we used to tie the boys. They used shoelaces to tie these boys. Left wrist to left ankle, right wrist to right ankle. Not really hog tying. It's a very strange sort of binding, because anybody who was conscious could easily get out of that. But apparently they were beaten severely before they were drowned, and so and two of them were mutilated with knives, a knife or knives, and so they were almost certainly unconscious long before they were placed in the water. So binding them for the sake of incapacitating them so they wouldn't flee was not really an issue at that point. So the original bindings were just a puzzle in itself, which to me had a ritualistic, to the police at the time, it had a ritualistic aspect, and it has one to me as well. So I can't prove that because, nobody's ever proven that there was actually a ritual going on there. But Damien Echols is big into, that's all he ever talks about. That's all he's ever thought about, apparently, is our magic ritual.
Yeah, he's a nice guy. He's a real nice peach.
He's obsessed with that. Mm-hmm. And so it had that aspect of it, and there's other aspects of the setting and the time and everything I won't get into now that you could build I built a case that you could at least interpret it as an occult crime. So, if you want to say it wasn't, there's no absolute conclusive proof of that. Though Jesse Miskelly gave in his initial confession to police described how he was involved with Damien and Jason in satanic rituals. Hence, hence the satanic panic that ensued whenever the West Memphis populace found out that somebody who said he was a Satanist was charged. Three kids that said they were Satan, one that said he was, one who was an admitted magician, and the best friend of the admitted magician were arrested for this crime. A lot of people jumped to the wild conclusion that maybe Satanists were involved in this murder, and it might even have been a ritual. It doesn't seem like such a stretch to me. But, we're getting off the subject a little bit here. But anyway, so what happened was, we're not subject, but the main thing.
We're not known for that at all.
Well, it's hard not to wander off into tangents with this case, honestly.
There's so many tentacles.
Yeah, there's so many little side streets and everything. Anyway, what happened was Binka was allowed to see the evidence. The supporters go wild with ecstasy because now it's going to be retested. Mara Leverett is putting out these stories that make it sound like, oh, the retesting is going to happen just any minute now. I was just looking at one where she's quoting the city attorney of West Memphis, Michael Stevenson, saying, the evidence is ready to be retested. Well, of course it's ready to be retested. It's ready to been retested since 1993, 94, when they gathered it, cataloged it, put it all together. I mean, it's ready to go when the order comes. The order hasn't come yet, and there are severe legal impediments beyond the plea deal that they made to ordering the retesting of this evidence. You don't just willy-nilly go out and retest DNA evidence in a closed case. The state has a responsibility to preserve its own interest in this, and, they've got a conviction. They can't justify the expense and the trouble without some sort of overriding reason for going out and retesting. And the only reason that there is public outcry. And that is it. There's nothing else going on with this. But there are severe legal impediments to this. There are state laws that stipulate what the conditions that that anybody who wants retesting has to go through. And the West Memphis 3 fail one after another of those provisions. And it's a fairly long list. If they could pass one hurdle, they'd still have another one in front of them. What they seem to be hoping for is, Mara says that, the evidence is going to be she's writing it up like the evidence is just about to be retested. She says that Binka says that Cressman has no objection to the retesting, but Cressman hasn't said that. And I suspect what I suspect is the truth is if the West Memphis attorneys go to the courts and the court orders retesting, Cressman's going to say, "Oh, well, okay, sure, we'll go along with the retesting." He's not going to fight it real hard, perhaps, but at the same time, he wants the court. He wants the court order from this, and they haven't filed it. I don't think they can pass the legal bar to have retesting, but I could be wrong. It looks to me like they are trying to shop around this matter to various judges. They said it before one judge, circuit judge over in that district, and she responded that she doesn't handle those kind of cases. So they have now, Mara is saying that, it's going to go to this other judge, Tanya Alexander, and I covered some, it was relatively minor stuff, but I covered some cases that Tanya Alexander handled as a municipal judge and in West Memphis and Marion, Arkansas, back in 2011, 2014. So I'm sort of vaguely familiar with her, and she's the first Black female judge they've had, I think, certainly in that district and maybe in the whole state, and maybe they're hoping they'll get a more favorable ruling from her. I didn't get the impression she wasn't that easy on the people that I saw. She was kind of tough on the people that I saw that were before in the cases that I saw.
It's almost insulting. It's almost insulting that Mara believes that because she's a black judge, that somehow she'll feel sympathetic for these three.
Yeah, well, I don't know if Mara believes that.
I'm
maybe
sure she
Binka
does.
believes that, and maybe for all I know, Binka and her went to law school together and they're friends. I don't know. That was the case actually with Binka and the Attorney General at the time. At the time of the release, Dustin McDaniel, they were friends, and they kind of worked out the deal for having a plea deal there. But they had to talk Ellington into it, and I don't think they had to talk very hard to get him to go along with it.
And
Because he said, Kerry Hobbs said this in a recent interview, that he was told by Ellington that he just wanted to be rid of the case because it was a nuisance.
mm-hmm.
And, he wanted it out of his hair.
And Scott Ellington is who exactly, for the people who are uninitiated?
He was the prosecuting attorney back in 2011. He signed off on the plea deal allowing the Alfred plea and the release of West Memphis 3. He was the prosecuting attorney up until the end of last year when he was moved into he's the judge now. And so they had a new prosecuting attorney, Cressman. Cressman said he's going to have a court order. But they make this all sound like it's just going to happen just any minute. But I don't see anything happening.
So why haven't they filed then? What's your impression?
I think they're trying to do just simply some sort of runaround where they just can simply bypass all the usual legal constraints they'd have and get some judge to simply go, oh yeah, let's have retesting.
And do you think they even want the retesting?
That could happen, and if the state decides not to contest it in a strong way, and they might not, then that could happen. Preston could take it upon himself to say, "Oh, there's so much." He has to come up with a rationale, but he could come up with some reason for it to be retesting if he really wanted to. I think so many questions raised about this. So questions were all from the supporter side. And they're not valid questions. It all goes back to the fact that they found a hair that may or may not be. Really, a lot of it goes back to the fact they found a hair that may or may not be linked to Kerry Hobbs in a shoelace of a boy that was in his home, because all three boys were in his home the day of the killings. Kerry wasn't there, but the boys were. That any one of those boys could have picked up a hair in that home as transference.
Especially with Terry's hair at that time. It was all flowy like Tom Cruise and
he had puffy hair back then. But anyway, it's not as puffy now.
He also wore a Michael Jackson jacket with the zipper going straight across it, and the big aviators. I remember going, he is doing it.
It was the 90s.
I loved it. I loved it.
Members only jackets and all that stuff. John Mark Byers had, this grotesque mullet, and
he also wore a button-up USA flag shirt, which was awesome too.
Yes. Anyway, so I don't really, I actually don't understand what's going on in the case. It's very muddled, and as I say, the news reports, the reports that Mara's channeling whatever the defense attorneys tell her, and basically just sort of tossing it out there without really doing any. I mean,
and just like Scott Ellington,
she's not doing her due. She's not. I won't get onto her. She doesn't care, but she's not doing her due diligence and really just checking around and see what's actually going on.
Well, similar.
But nobody else is either.
Why don't you explain exactly who Mara is? Because we use her name often. She's a big figure in this case for bringing attention to the case. She also has an agenda, and I guess that could be said for all of us. We all feel a certain way, but who is Mara Everett?
Well, she's a reporter. I don't know her total employment history, but she was working for I think it's the Arkansas Times, and I don't know if she was actually employed by them or had some sort of freelance status. but she had frequent bylines in there, and she had made a small name for herself with covering a case that's famously known as the Boys on the Tracks case, about a couple of boys who were found on railroad tracks in West Memphis, and they think that somehow it's tied in. She just, I guess I'm going to give her a plug here, but I don't mean to, but she's got a new book out on it, about Mena, Arkansas, with that fake were Barry Seals and other shady governmental figures were bringing in cocaine from South America there, and there was all these intimations that the Clintons were somehow involved in it. It's great if you want to dig into conspiracy theories.
Yeah, it's always.
But and there's probably, I mean, I think there's something there. It's just what that something is kind of hard to tell. And I'm not going to buy her book, and I'm not going to read it. No apologies, but maybe she nails it with it. I don't know. Anyway, she wrote this. She did some reporting on this case fairly early on, and then wrote after Paradise Lost came out, 96, I think, which is 3 years after on HBO, 3 years after the killings, and 2 years after they were convicted. The first of the Paradise Lost movies came out on HBO. It made quite a splash. There really weren't a lot of true crime documentaries of any sort around, if any. So it was a pioneer in the subject matter. It's also a very well done piece of propaganda.
Agreed.
How I put it.
Agreed.
It's very effective. I mean, look, I was familiar with the case. I thought they were guilty. I've always thought they were guilty. I saw the movie, and I still thought they were guilty.
Agreed.
But I didn't realize at the time,
how guilty.
I hadn't done that much research on it, how much evidence just simply was not shown. I mean, we could go on down the list. I don't really want to do all that now, but he just one of the more significant things was somebody, two people who knew Damien saw him walking along the side of the road in muddy clothes with about 2 hours, very close to where the crime scene were, in the dark.
Yeah, the service road
where the crime scene was, and they knew him, and very, very well. And and that was, two of those family members testified in court, and you don't see even a mention of that, except for one brief, obscure allusion in some conversation in the whole movie.
Well,
but they spent a whole lot of time. They spent a whole lot of time showing the signs on local churches and all that stuff.
I do believe that Fogelman, the attorney for the prosecution, did mention the Hollingsworth clan, but they did not go into detail at all.
Right.
And that's a big detail.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. Is he just simply mentioned it in passing. They did, it was made pretty clear that Jesse Miskelly gave a detailed interview, or gave a detailed confession, which really broke open the case. But it just seems as if, the fact that Damien was a suspect just sort of came out of the blue, that they picked on him because he wore black. A lot of it had to do with the claim they wore black. I hate to even go into this again, but I guess I need to. They were wearing black T-shirts. They listened to Metallica, and they had funny haircuts. Well, half the kids in West Memphis at the time had funny haircuts. Quite a few of them were wearing black T-shirts. And Metallica was one of the biggest bands in the world at the time. There's no reason why any of that would show up on a police radar.
Hey, Gary, I'm wearing a black T-shirt right now. I listened to Master of Puppets twice yesterday, and I have somewhat of a funny haircut. Sometimes I wear a man bun.
Has anybody reported you to the police yet? You might be a suspect. No,
I haven't been accused of anything quite like that because of my appearance and my music style. No.
Around that time, I was going into this pool hall occasionally, which is not the place I really hung around a lot, but I had some friends in there, so I go and see them, and they played Metallica all the time. So, and you know, and I was a 40-year, and I knew who they were, and I was a 40-year-old something guy at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, it's not as if they were some obscure heavy metal band. I mean, if you said Slayer, which they were fans of Slayer too, but if you said Slayer, I might not have known you were talking about. But Metallica, they were huge.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's no reason why any of that should have showed on police radar. How would the police even know who they were listening to, what music they were listening to? And why would they care?
Well, Damien
it's
they would have to tell them, right?
Yeah, you know, I mean, they did find concert T-shirts after the fact, and
yes.
they did show those the T-shirts did show up in the trial, but I'm not really sure what that was supposed to prove. But and you could argue, well, they were convicted on that basis. Well, they weren't convicted on that basis. They were convicted on the basis of all the other evidence that was brought in there, and there was evidence well beyond what was brought into court that the West Memphis Three were guilty. And nothing exonerating was ever presented. Any potentially exonerating evidence was presented then, and nothing is presented since. Their attempted alibis absolutely fell through, and total disaster. Damien Echols was a disaster in his testimony. He really convicted himself. If the jury had any reservations about his guilt after he got through testifying, I think all those reservations went away.
Jason's own attorney said that he would have convicted him.
Yeah.
In Paradise Lost.
He looks really bad, and Damien also looks. I mean, you can't convict somebody for being creepy, but Damien's real creepy in Paradise Lost. I don't know how anybody can look at that and go,
creepy today.
This guy's a weirdo. He's a creep. He's probably he is talking about reveling in the fact that they're going to call him the West Memphis Boogeyman,
and he's accused for a triple murder.
Yeah, right. But get back to present day, I don't have any idea what's actually going on. I was very skeptical all the way back when they first started talking about missing evidence, because it was not from a really good source. I mean, you would think the prosecuting attorney wouldn't tell the defense attorney that, but even so, he certainly didn't have firsthand knowledge of. He was not responsible for the care and storage of the evidence, and I don't know where this story started, but you know, now they're promising they're going to do some sort of full-scale investigation to how these stories started and all that. And, you know, who knows? Maybe it was some dispatcher or something at the West Memphis police department said, oh, I think some of that evidence got destroyed. And the next thing you know, it's a big, I mean, I don't know what happened. That's speculation. It wasn't as if the Memphis police chief, and there's been a lot of controversy about that too, because the West Memphis police chief, who put in his resignation really a couple of weeks before this news broke about seeing the evidence. It was really recently that he saw the evidence, but it was right before Christmas. But he made his official resignation to the public that day. It was very bad timing, if nothing else. And it made it look like the West Memphis police chief somehow was being booted out, even though he was resigning. But we know how that works. Finding he didn't go get a better job, he just sort of left to pursue other opportunities, which is another euphemism for I'm being forced out, as everybody knows. It made it look like he was somehow being booted out because of the West Memphis Three matter. And
well, that's certainly what Damien would want you to believe.
Well, they certainly spun it that way, but the fact is he was only on the job for 6 months. Most of the stuff that had gone on in the case had happened before he ever showed up. You could say he didn't handle his public relations in dealing with the so-called missing evidence very well, but that was true of the guy that was involved. that had the job before him. And but all the parties involved said that in West Memphis, and you can say, well, I don't believe them, but this is what they said. It had nothing to do with the West Memphis case. It was just a coincidental. The events were coincidental. They just happened the same day, or more or less. And the fact is it just bad. It was bad timing. It was a bad look. I've met the current mayor of West Memphis back when he was a city councilman. He's prone to just shoot off his mouth about a lot of stuff, and so I'm not surprised he was one of the sources of this. And I like the guy. I liked him, and I think he's a skilled politician. I don't know how good he is at this. I sort of have my doubts about him as an administrator, et cetera, but he's a fairly skilled politician. But for West Memphis, which is another qualifier, but it doesn't surprise me that he would be a source of bad information on this. But Cressman is that he would say that to the defense attorney is a puzzle to me. I will say there was some evidence missing in 2011 that they were aware of. There was the stomach contents of the boys was simply gone. Nobody knew where it went, and the paper bags in which the pieces of evidence were stored, which could have been used, could have been sources of testing for DNA. They had been destroyed or somehow gotten rid of. And, paper bags are what they generally store those kind of items in, clothing and so forth. And these clothes were wet, so it was even more problematic about the storage. But they did make an issue of it back in 2011 about those pieces of evidence being missing. So that's already water under the bridge. The whole thing's water under the bridge. The case is closed, man. The case is closed.
And yet here we are again.
We're talking about.
And
like something's really happening.
Well, let's talk turkey about it. Let's get to the nitty gritty about it, because we're saying all these things. There is no new evidence. That's not true. Evidence hasn't been destroyed. Correct. That's not true.
It's not true.
And they keep saying that they're going to file for new evidence, or for new testing of old evidence that has been sitting there for a long time.
That's already been tested. And
they could have newer technologies right now.
Well, they could have. They've had new technologies since the original retesting, and there's probably been some advances in DNA testing since 2011. But the MVAC technology was available in 2011.
Right.
The defense attorneys just did not use it. That technology was fairly new then. It was not very well known, but it was around. It was just starting to make its way into the public eye around 2011, but it was there.
Okay, Gary, you're being too nice now. So let's talk about Damien. The reason that this is going on, in my personal opinion, is it's nothing more than Damien Echols trying to take advantage of his Patreon supporters. The money's drying up. He's not doing any of the things that he said he's going to do. His magic school never started. Shocker there.
Nope. No, I haven't seen word once since he announced it, since his big announcement last year.
Nope. And, what it does is it keeps his followers and his core group of followers engaged and supporting him.
Yeah.
And that's what this really is about. Okay. Because if it was about exonerating himself, this would already be filed. Damien would have 10 times more money than he ever would if the testing was favorable for him, which it won't be because it wasn't in 2011. And like you said, this evidence has been sitting around for many years, even when they had $10 to $20 million in their defense fund and the greatest experts ever available to them couldn't even find something that would exonerate them. And when I say exonerate, meaning it proves for a fact that they didn't do this, other than fake things like when they say that Damien knows he's not exonerated because he signed an Alford plea, but most people don't even know or care, which I don't blame them, what an Alford plea is. The optics of it are that Damien was a convicted child murderer on death row, and one day he is let out. That looks terrible, but there's so much more to it than that, people. I gotta really express that to you. This is not, people say all the time to me, Gary, well, why would they let them out? Why would they this? Why would they that? They didn't. Scott Ellington did.
Scott Ellington did. I've gone over this before. Dustin McDaniel, number one, Dustin McDaniel and Patrick Vinca are law partners now, which tells you how tight they were back in the day. They were friends. It was a friendly deal they made between the two of them. McDaniel positioned himself in good old Arkansas triangulation style as opposed to the move and claiming that the West Memphis Three were still guilty, but everything he did worked against that. McDaniel was planning on running for governor at the time, and he had a sex scandal that blew up in his face, and so he's back in a private law practice.
I hate when that happens.
Scott Ellington, there was a new Republican congressman in Jonesboro, the area that includes Crittenden County, the congressional district as well. There was a new Republican congressman in office who I think had only been in office one term. It's a district that surprises a lot of people. There's a lot of Democrats, a lot of old yellow dog Democrats in Arkansas who will vote Democrat no matter what, particularly for more local races. And Scott Ellington is a Democrat. He was going to run on the Democratic. He did run on the Democratic ticket against this guy and got beaten, but he did run against him. And part of his problem was he didn't want the West Memphis Three case clouding up his prospects for his congressional victory, which didn't occur
twice. Right.
He didn't tell this. I talked to the guy a couple of times, but
Trump would have called him a loser. He's a loser.
He called up one of my reporters. I was managing editor. Okay, so I had a couple of reporters. Anyway, he told one of the reporters he couldn't understand why people in Crittenden County were upset with him over the release of the West Memphis Three. He didn't understand the politics of this. He didn't understand the community feeling about this. He didn't understand the case. He confessed later he really didn't know that much about it. I doubt if he had any real serious, he certainly had no serious interest in retrying it. No prosecutor wants to go back in and retry a case that's 10, 15, or in this case, 18, or by the time they got around to it, 19 or 20 years old. No prosecutor wants to retry it. It's hard to retry. Evidence degrades, memories erode, people die. One of their top witnesses was, in terms of there was some physical evidence in the case, and I can't pronounce her last name. Nobody ever could, but her name Lisa I can't say it, but I don't know how to pronounce her name. But she worked for the state. She worked for the crime lab. She gave most of the testimony about the little bit of physical evidence they did have, which were some fibers and candle wax. She gave most of the testimony about that were linked to the candle wax was linked to Damien, and Dominique, his girlfriend, had that candle at her house. There were 3 different places where they found that candle wax that was very similar to wax that was found on an item of Stevie Branch's clothing, and Stevie being one of the victims. And they found a couple of fibers that, were seemed to be matches for items of clothing from Damien's house or from Jason's house. a red fiber that matched one of Jason's mother's nightgowns, and a green fiber that seemed to be a match for a T-shirt that Damien Echols. It's not well known, but he did have a little brother that was I think he was a half brother or maybe a step brother, but his father had been married like a zillion times, and he had gotten other kids along the way. And the boy wasn't living with him, I don't think, but he had spent some time there, and there was a shirt from the house that matched a fiber from. There was a shirt at the house that matched a fiber that she identified. Now, that isn't strong physical evidence, but it is physical evidence. So people who say there's no physical evidence, it's not true. You would never convict anybody on the basis of that evidence. You would never, just as you would never, even so much as you think about arresting, say Terry Hobbs on the basis of mitochondrial DNA found on a single hair. I will tell you this though, if they did retest the two places, and the defense knows this, but they don't really mention one of the prime sources they would have for actually coming up with decent DNA samples. One would be the shoelaces. Somebody handled those shoelaces, and whoever tied up the boys handled those shoelaces. And there were some very small skin fragments that really did not yield any useful DNA samples back in 93, 94. And I presume I guess they must have tested it again in 2011, 2012. So we don't ever know what the actual results of the testing in 2011 rather, because they've never released the results of that. But let's presume they did do extensive testing on those shoelaces. Perhaps those little skin fragments might show something. I don't know. You have to consider the fact that we really don't know. Some of this evidence was handled by policemen after the fact. Been around sitting around for a long time to pick up DNA that way, unless it's very carefully sealed. And we don't know. Maybe one of Stevie Branch's teachers tied his shoes that day for him. You just don't know what happened.
Of course.
But if you found, I don't expect this to happen, but say if you found Terry Hobbs's DNA on all the shoelaces, then you would go, oh, well, that's very suspicious. I don't think that's going to happen. If you found any DNA that could positively link to Damien, Jesse, or Jason, I can tell you what would happen. They would say, oh, this is planted.
Mm.
That would be exactly what would happen. Oh, they had years to plant evidence there. They planted that DNA. And the supporters would buy that.
That's a good point.
Stephen Avery's supporters bought something even more outlandish with the DNA there. So why wouldn't they buy this with the West Memphis 3?
Why would they kill Teresa Hall back? Why wouldn't they just kill Stephen Avery so they didn't have to pay him? You ever think about that?
Yeah. Not only that, there would probably been a lot of potential suspects for that killing too.
Well, yeah, people hated the guy.
He's a creepy guy.
He really
He's a creepy
is.
guy.
He really is, man.
I don't get there's even almost a personality cult about him that even the Damien thing I can sort of explain, because everybody who thought they were an edgy goth teenager back in 1993 identifies with him, and that's part of his appeal.
Did you happen to catch the show that I was on the other day? Did you watch any of that?
No, I didn't see it.
Oh, thanks.
No. What was it? What was it?
It was about the West Memphis 3. I think I sent it to you.
I didn't. I looked for it. I couldn't find it.
Oh, okay. Well, anyway, when I was doing the show, what's that?
I didn't get it. No.
Oh, okay. I'll resend it. But
yeah, I looked for it. I couldn't find it.
Here's the part. When I was in there and I saw that people were talking about this, and so I was invited up by the host of the show, they were all very cool and very open and listening to people speak.
Yeah, we did talk about this.
I was shocked that the chat was probably 90 or at least 85-15 guilty. And that surprised me because I feel as though that now that we're in the information age and we weren't back in 92, 93, people can now look for themselves instead of having to be spoon-fed the information about this case. And by the way, there is so much out there about this case. You wrote 2 books about it and then had to condense it into one. And I'm not saying that that is all what you're telling is evidence, but you're telling the story and you share the evidence, because we go back to this all the time, Gary, and you and I use this term. The totality of the evidence to me is overwhelming. That's just how it is to me, or me.
Right. And I have to say, and maybe this, I will say, okay, you can call this confirmation bias if you wish, but over the years, the more I look at the case, the more I see Damien's actions, the more I see Jason's actions, who's also complicit in wanting. He's got a little innocence project down, Proclaim Justice down in Austin, Texas. It's a very small time operation. And I just looked on his website a day or two ago, and he was begging for money then. And he's not really, that as far as I'm concerned, I'm not going to quite. I'm going to call it a scheme rather than scam, so I don't want to open myself up to any problems with that. But to me, it looks like a scheme just to get money. He's not really handling. He's not handling any cases. He's not handling any cases that even have a hope of going anywhere. And he's taking credit, like he was promoting this case of Tim Howard as if, as if it was some sort of wrongful conviction case. The guy's a convicted murderer at Arkansas case. Mara Everett was very involved with that. Mara and Jason Baldwin are kind of buddy, more so than she's more buddy with him than she is anybody. She wrote a book about Jason's He-Man adventures in prison and all that. Anyway, Jason is acting as if he has something to do with this convicted murderer getting out on parole. He had zilch to do with it. Maybe he bought him lunch afterward, but that would be about it.
Nah, he didn't do that.
And so he wants money too. What I was going to say, the other source of potential DNA in this case could be very telling, and it is what appears to have been a semen stain on Stevie Branch's pants. Now, generally speaking, 8-year-old boys don't produce a whole lot of semen stains. They just don't have the equipment for it yet. So the idea that it would come from one of the boys is flatly ridiculous. None of the autopsy reports indicate that they were unusually well developed for 8-year-olds, and so it obviously came from some outside source. The DNA testing back in 1993, 94, they had some indications that it was, everything they tested showed it was almost certainly semen, but they couldn't get any usable samples because back then the dye apparently interfered with the DNA process. I mean, they just couldn't get anything out of that sample. Now, so the only reasonable source for that stain would be somebody who actually assaulted Stevie Branch, which would have been Damien Echols. If you go on basis of Jesse Viskelly's description of who attacked who at the crime scene, Jason basically wasn't exactly castration, but he demanded Christopher Byers. He cut him in the deep, the horrible wounds in the groin and other wounds. He also stabbed Stevie in the face, but Damien was focusing on beating up Stevie. Jesse was focusing on beating up Michael Moore, and Jason was focusing on beating up and mutilating Christopher Byers. One reason Michael Moore didn't have any cutting wounds is because Jason wanted to cut on him and Jesse wouldn't let him do it. Weirdly enough, he's beating the kid to death, but he didn't want him cut. Murders don't necessarily act rationally. Anyway, if they did some testing on that, maybe they would get something usable from that at this point. Who knows? I really doubt that they're going to get in. If they did do retesting, and maybe they will, if they can skirt around the legalities enough, maybe the testing will go forward.
Well,
but if they do get some usable samples, that would be a prime source. Jesse Miskelly described, not in his first confession, but he made a number of confessions that are on the record. You can read the transcripts on CallahanMySide.com, which is where a vast amount of these records relating to the case.
Link in the description as well, please. I will put that there. So
If you really want to learn about the case, read that. It's not complete. It's not thousands and thousands of pages, but it's not complete, but it's pretty complete.
It's amazing.
Yeah, it's a tremendous amount of read. If somebody wanted to read all that, it would take, I don't know how long to do it. I can't claim I've read every word of every routine motion filed with the courts and all that. I've read quite a bit of it, and I go back to it all the time.
Also, Exhibit 500 is fun if you want to have a nice little afternoon nap and then read some light reading. Exhibit 500 would be good for you.
Yeah, and that is over 500 pages of descriptions of the treatments that the notes and official hospital documents from Damien Echols' 3 trips to mental hospitals in the year before he was arrested for this.
Gary, that's a list that would be for somebody that's like 80 years old. He was 17, right? Not even that at that point.
Yeah, and in one case, the first time was he threatened to kill himself, and he also threatened to. He'd also made some other threats, and that was in Arkansas. He went to Oregon with his parents briefly, which is a total disaster for everybody involved, and got drunk, apparently, threatened to kill his father, threatened to eat his father with a spoon, cut his mother's throat, kill himself, etc., etc. Got sent to St. Vincent's in Portland for a relatively short stay, but they got a lot of documents on him. Came back to Arkansas and violated his terms of his release and from his probation because he was under probation for the activities he'd done back in May and June, and was put in a juvenile detention center and got put in the charter hospital again in Little Rock for either trying to drink the blood or actually drinking the blood of one of the other boys in detention. He professed to gain his magical occult powers partially through the drinking of blood, which is not something a normal kid does, not even a normal goth kid back in 1993 does.
So are you telling me that he wasn't in mental institutions for depression?
He was depressed. That's part of the diagnosis, yes.
Well, he says that's the only reason.
Well, they had to come up with, listen, they came up with a long list of diagnoses for the guy. He diagnosed himself in his Social Security application. His description was, I'm not going to be able to rattle off all the things he said, but he said he was suicidal, he was homicidal, he was manic depressive, he was schizophrenic, and had drug and alcohol problems.
I think he called himself a psychopath too.
He also called himself a sociopath in the document. I knew somebody who was married to somebody who was who basically is the lady that gave him the form to fill out in West Memphis, and she told her husband that she asked him why he was filing, and he said, "I'm a psychopath," which is not something the lady heard very often. It was memorable.
Yeah, well, he's right, wasn't he?
yeah, and there was other things going on with the other boys. Jesse had was on probation at the time for beating up a little girl.
And she was about 8 years old, correct? Or
yeah, and he'd gotten in trouble just sometime before that. I can go back and find the exact dates for hitting another like a 6-year-old in the head with a rock. God. He beat up this little 12-year-old girl, and he claimed he was screwing, and she didn't appreciate that, by the way.
I don't blame
her. And her boyfriend, because he was mad because she was mad at him, so he beat him up, and he didn't get in legal trouble for that. Damien was stalking people, which is kind of typical for that sort of people who have his kind of mental problems, and was seen. Somebody who met his description was seen actually spying on little girls playing in a yard and seemed to be masturbating himself while he was watching them.
Correct.
So, yeah, nice guy.
Oh yeah, he's
just
great.
Just a normal teenager.
He's just
you did all that stuff when you did all that stuff when you were a teenager, didn't you?
I played baseball. My childhood was robbed of the sacrificial aspect of gaining powers through blood drinking.
Well, mine was a lot more suspicious, and I spent a lot of time reading science fiction and stuff like that.
Well, there you go.
Whatever.
I guess to each their own, right?
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, I don't know what's going to come of all this. It is all the news reports don't really drill down to get to the nitty gritty on this as to what can actually happen. Binka has not explained himself. These media reports very well about how he's actually going to accomplish what he says he's going to accomplish. He's bragging about, oh yeah, we found the shoelaces, we found the ligatures. Now we can have retesting. Well, he didn't mention the semen stain, but if they were going to do all this, the idea from that's been thrown out there is they're going to test all this stuff. But remains to be seen if they ever actually do retesting, what they actually do retest. If all they do is the shoelaces, which would be fairly inexpensive compared to the huge expense they're going to incur if they test everything, who knows what that would find?
Who has to pay for it?
Look, yeah, look, if it turns out that there's a famous serial killer who left his DNA in all 3 shoelaces, and I was wrong all these years, that, that's too bad, but there was a lot of evidence against Damien. I don't think that's going to happen. If it turns out that Terry Hobbs' DNA is all 3 shoelaces, all the shoelaces, all 6 shoelaces, it's mighty suspicious. But if it's, I don't think that's going to happen.
Or if Damien's semen ended up being on one of the boys, that'd be mighty suspicious too.
That would be more than suspicious. That would be downright convicting as far as I'm concerned.
I agree with that. So do they get to choose what gets tested and what doesn't?
It's being, well, they could go to the court and ask specific items to be tested. They could do that. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I don't know if they can do anything, and I'm not sure they could even actually go and file this motion without some sort of severe retribution from the courts. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it would be. A permanent barring of any further motions in the case would probably be about all the courts could really do. They can't put the 3 back in prison or anything like that for violating.
Well, that's the thing.
Agreement. They're out off parole. They can't put them back in prison for violating the provisions of their plea deal.
So that is something I wanted to touch on because it's very interesting that you say that, because say they have something retested and it comes up with Damien's DNA is all over the place. They have this new DNA, say 5 years in advance or in the future, where they can pull all this DNA off. And I'm not saying that this is going to happen, but if that does happen, and it is seen that that DNA from Damien, Jason, and Jesse are everywhere, there is no legal repercussions for them other than people going, well, shit, that just confirms that they're guilty. They're not going to get put back in prison for it. It doesn't matter what it turns up in. It's all about the civil aspect of it. If somehow they find some miracle, but that's just the reason that they're, I guess you could say, pussyfooting around this DNA testing is because they know the same thing that they knew back in 2006, 2009, 2012, and 2016 and 1994, that they are guilty of this crime. They have pleaded guilty to this crime instead of going forward with a new evidentiary hearing. They were offered a new evidentiary hearing and had a shot at a new trial, but they didn't trust the evidence. So they took an Alford plea, which was presented to Scott Ellington, not from Scott Ellington, from Damien's defense attorneys, correct?
And it was, for somebody sitting in prison, it was a sweetheart deal of a lifetime, particularly when you're guilty of a crime.
Sign me up. I take it.
Yeah. And honestly, even if you're not, and you don't want to take a chance on a retrial, I don't really think. Yeah, I mean, honestly, the evidence they would have had, well, I know of the evidence they would have had against Jason at a retrial, they would have had a very hard time reconvicting that boy. Michael Carson's story of his confession to Jason was one of the primary bits of evidence against Jason. I just don't see Michael Carson, who was in detention with Jason, and Jason says he confessed to Michael Carson. I don't see Michael Carson at this point with things he said, a few things he said in public, going back and testifying again about what Jason told him in juvenile lockup. And the defense attorneys would have gone after him with everything they had to discredit him. And other than that, they didn't really have a whole lot on Jason. Jason is one thing that, some things that are incriminating you can't show in court. Damien and Jesse both failed polygraphs. You can't show that in court, but it's very incriminating. Something that is also somewhat incriminating, though it's a smart legal move, is Jason didn't say a damn word to anybody about any of this. Right. His mother told him to shut up in his initial interview, just a few days after the killings, and he didn't say a word since. And now, since then he's touted various alibi stories, none of which have ever worked out. Damien had 2 alibi stories. One of them just simply doesn't hold up on the record. He still throws it out there all the time. He was talking with these girls that evening. The girls say he wasn't talking to them that evening.
Right. They don't. It wasn't. And I've gone over that. You've gone over that in podcasts before. They would have. I mean, they would have executed Damien the next day. With not only that, the jury probably wouldn't have smiled upon an 18-year-old talking to a 12-year-old that was considered to be his other girlfriend, because and particularly with his 16-year-old girlfriend was sitting in court pregnant or with a baby at the time. She might have been 17 by then, but it seems though pedophilia runs in the family too.
Yeah, and so that was one of his alibis. He didn't present that one. The one he did present got shot down real heavily, and that was he was over watching Beverly Hills 90201, whatever it is, 90210, and 90210. I know what it is. I just got off track. Over at a friend's house with his parents and his sister at the time, which is a real edgy thing to do, by the way. But particularly if you're like the coolest goth teen in West Memphis,
right?
But that got shot down. So
and why did that get shot down? And I know the answer to it, but
well, among other things, the girl that they number one, this girl was practically a member of the family. They were very, very close friends. So that automatically raises the question: how he's like 12 years old, and she's their primary witness,
Right? But what was on?
And then she said that this visit occurred a couple of days before her boyfriend's band concert. Well, the only band concert the boyfriend would have been involved in was 2 weeks later. So that got shot down heavily. So it was just bad evidence.
But I don't know if you were headed that way or not. But explain what was actually on TV at what time when Damien said he was watching and what he was watching.
I'm missing the point on this because Beverly Hills 210 was on that evening.
Right, but there was a TV. I can't exactly remember, but there was a TV show.
There's a controversy about this because supposedly it was prom night or something on Beverly Hills 210, and if you find some sources, it says that wasn't the episode, but there's other sources that say it was. I don't know.
Yeah.
Based on all that, if you look at Wikipedia, I think it says I try to remember how this works, but I think it may actually describe when the shows were aired, and I think it does say it was on that night.
But it was the wrong time. It was the wrong time and the wrong show is what I was getting at. Said, what's that?
No, I don't think so.
Well,
tell me what you're.
I'll have to go back and double check, but what I recall was that he said that he was watching a certain show at 8:00 that didn't come on till 10:00, and
no.
What? No?
Beverly Hills 210. I think it was on at 7.
I'm gonna have to check.
7 Central Time, and he said he was over there around 7. What's interesting? You speak of the television shows. Interesting, and this is the kind of stuff that pops up occasionally. Well after the fact, and you go, oh, he just incriminated himself. Jason said that he came home that night and ate his mom's casserole, and his mom was off working, and watched Wonder Years on TV. Wonder Years came on TV at 10:00 that night.
So that's where. Okay, that's what I was talking
Jason
about.
did not get home until probably 9:30 or later that evening. There was his mother was living with had moved in. She kicked out her drunken boyfriend. Actually, Jason had chased him out with a baseball bat. Her stepfather, and she moved in this small-time criminal named Dink Dent into the trailer in Lakeshore State, and Dink Dent gave some very detailed and very specific and very time-stamped evidence to police in his interview that had Jason coming home. He gave various times. It was always much later than say 7:00 at night. It was always trending toward Jason being home in time to talk to his mother when his mother called at 9:30 that night from work. So Jason says now that he cut his uncle's lawn, his great uncle Hubert's lawn, went to Walmart, played some video games, and went home. It says his only witness there was what he called the Asian kid. The only Asian kid they could find said, I thought I saw him that night, but it turns out it was a different night.
Well,
that wasn't presented at trial. Jason had essentially no defense at trial. His attorney was hoping that the evidence was weak and that the jury would just simply pass on Jason. They didn't go for that.
So that's what I was thinking about was there was a time differential on a TV show, but that was with Jason, not Damien.
Yeah.
And
with Jesse, there were two alibis that he attempted. One was that he's supposedly borderline retarded, but supposedly he was negotiating with police and some parents over a woman slapping a kid that he was somehow had gotten involved in at his trailer park, and around 6:30. The problem is the sheriff's department and the police department, three officers, two different departments, neither one of them West Memphis. all knew Jason. Jesse. They knew his dad. They knew the family. I wonder why,
Yeah,
but
exactly.
they didn't see Jesse anywhere around there.
Right.
The other thing was a wrestling trip that Jesse supposedly took to. I think I usually know this, but it's Mark Tree. I think maybe it's Wynn. I think it's Mark Tree though. Doesn't really matter where they were going actually, but they were going to go professional wrestle practice that evening because Jesse wanted to be a professional wrestler, and supposedly that would have given him an alibi when actually it didn't. He had time to get home from the killing and go on the trip if it started as late as some of the witnesses testified. However,
he didn't even go.
The
right?
main witness who testified about this was a small-time professional wrestler named Fred Revell, and Fred said that he had given some money to the owner of this little theater for the wrestling rink they had the wrestling rink they had in there, and the receipt for that was produced, and it was from the week before, not May 5th. So that was shot down. So none of these alibis held up.
Right. And I do want to also say that this year we have lost two, I guess you could call them prominent people in the West Memphis 3 case. Pam Echols, I don't know, what was her last name at the time? I can't remember. Damien's mother has passed.
Pam Metcalf. She was Pam Echols at the time the killings occurred. She was Pam Hutchison and had remarried his father, Damien's father, Joe Eddie Hutchison, by the time of the trial, the arrest and trial, or by the time of the trial. And she was Pam Echols. I'm sorry. She was Pam Echols in May 1992. She was married to Jack Echols. They split up. She married Joe Eddie within the next year, which created some problems for Damien because he really didn't know his dad. That created some of the problems. Some of the problems they would have had on the trip to Oregon, but that wouldn't have worked out even if the dad had been like a wonderful dad, but he probably wasn't. But she was Pam Echols, Pam Hutchison, and then she was Pam Metcalf when she died. John Mark Byers died. Was it this summer or last summer?
I think it was last summer, 2020.
Yeah, 2000, I think. Mark Byers, also known as John Mark Byers, died in this really what was a kind of pathetic, stupid car accident. And Jesse Miskelly's father, Jesse Miskelly Sr., also known as Big Jesse, he's only about 5'8", 7'5", 8", but he's kind of a tough guy. He died, and Jesse had been living with him in this trailer park in, it's not in West Memphis, it's not in Marion, but it's really very close to Marion, Arkansas. And Marion and West Memphis are fairly close to each other. The city limits actually meet in some places, but not all together. But I don't want to get into how complicated all that is. But anyway, his father died, and that was one of Jesse's main emotional supports. He was always very supportive, but he said some things that didn't necessarily look real good for his son at times. But Jesse Sr. was very supportive of his son. Pam Metcalf was always very supportive of, and his sister Michelle Damien's sister Michelle were very supportive of Damien. Damien apparently had by everything I could see, he had nothing to do with them for the last 10 years or so before she died, and didn't say a word about his mother dying.
No.
When she died, which was around Mother's Day, and he didn't even say
it was the day before Mother's Day.
Really? It was. I knew it was very close. He didn't say word one. I mean, he didn't say word one about his mother, and I'm not saying he has to put everything personal out on Twitter, but guess what? He puts an awful lot of stuff out on Twitter, but didn't even say a word about his poor mother.
Right.
So we've had some significant figures die in particularly the last year, but also the year before that. And John Mark Byers is major figure in all this, as you know.
Yeah, and I've always talked about him, and he is a sympathetic figure. He had nothing to do with the killings of these three little boys, and HBO really went after him when that couldn't stick because he had a fantastic alibi. Then they turned to the next stepfather.
Harry Hobbs, who has a pretty good, it's not as good as Mark Byers, but it's a pretty good alibi.
Absolutely.
It's much better than any alibi that any of the three killers have ever presented.
Yeah, he's also not into slaughtering people.
David Jacoby describes all this interaction. When the killings were going on, David Jacoby describes all this interaction with Harry Hobbs. And we know he was seen around 8, somewhere between 8 and 8:30, up at right where the entranceway is into these woods across this bayou, the 10-mile bayou. We know he was there. I mean, Everybody agrees on that pretty much. But so he, even with that, the time frame for him committing this crime and getting cleaned up wasn't great. But Jacoby described, so unless you believe Jacoby's also involved in this, which I will say is ridiculous, Jacoby's not. Everything I've heard about the guy says he's just not. There's no way that guy would ever be involved in any kind of murder. But unless you believe Jacoby is involved with this, and there are a lot of people who do, the fact that he gives a pretty decent alibi to Hobbs, where Hobbs couldn't possibly have pulled this off, and still had all this interaction with Jacoby. It's a pretty good alibi. Particularly considering he wasn't trying to set up he wasn't trying to, hey, look, I got an alibi, folks. He's just out looking for his kid.
Well, that's funny that you say that, because this case that I've been covering for the last 5 months, the Summer Wells case, the father, all he talks about is having 7 alibis, which is odd.
Yeah, well, alibi, Damien's other alibi is his parents. And you know how good that is.
Yeah, it's solid. It's a good family. They did real good work.
Yeah, particularly people who she was shown to be. His mother testified, and she was a trade wreck as well. So I mean, I won't get into it, but she was an awful witness for the defense, and they just shouldn't have put the poor woman on the stand. She had mental problems. I'm not saying she was crazy, and I'm not saying that she's fairly intelligent. Those Echols people are actually fairly intelligent people, but they're not wired. Most of them aren't wired straight. She wasn't. Damien wasn't.
Still isn't.
So, yeah, it isn't. Yeah, but they're not stupid. Nope. Damien's not as smart as he thinks he is, but he's not stupid. Jason's not really very bright.
Nope.
Jesse's not bright at all. But
he's not retarded either.
No, he's not.
and that's one of the funnier aspects. We could talk about that stuff all day.
He can't help. I mean, he's really kind of a victim of his environment in a lot of ways, and probably genetics as well. So
genetic and I think that personally that Jason or Jesse liked to try and fit in. He wanted friends, and he'd go along with stupid plans. That happens.
He had a lot of social. He was actually more. You could argue he was much more socially intelligent than Damien has ever been.
I agree.
And he had a lot of people. He had a whole string of bad witnesses at his trial trying to give him an alibi, wearing yellow ribbons of support.
Yep.
With at least one of them proclaiming how much he loved Jesse. Which, the jury's going to buy this guy as an alibi witness? And they all tell contradictory stories. It was stupid.
Yeah, Stidham was in over his head, by the way. And the guy's he's like a circuit court judge or something like that. He didn't, first of all, he didn't have a lot to work with when it came to Jesse's defense. It's hard to defend people that confess and confess in detail and know things about the crime that others didn't. And people will say, oh, well, that was fed to him. Well, why wasn't it fed to the other 100 people before him? How did they just end up with 3 people that didn't have alibis? One of them happened to be into, sacrificial practices. told his girlfriend he wanted to sacrifice their first child. And, two little girls testified at trial saying, hey, we heard Damien talk about this. Why would they testify? Why would they testify, Gary, if they didn't hear that?
They heard it, and a lot of the other kids.
They were the only two that, they weren't the only ones that they were the only ones willing to testify.
Right.
Yeah. And that's a confession, by the way. That's a confession.
That's a confession. You can honestly say all three confessed. Damien confessed to the softball crowd. He also gave two confessions that almost made it to court. One to a guy that they were hanging out with that day, Ken Watkins, he was not around at the time of the killings, but he'd been hanging around. He showed up at Dominie's house like at 7:00 in the morning or something, to hung out there all day and hung out with them. Damien gave a kind of a confession to him, and he also gave a confession to a guy named William Jones when he was drunk one night, like a couple of weeks after the killings. But they both chickened out. Ron Lax went around, talked to these guys, and also talked to Buddy Lucas, to whom Jesse gave a confession the day after the killing.
Gave him his shoes.
Handed over his shoes to Buddy because he thought he had blood on it. They got the shoes back, but they couldn't get any blood back from it. But Buddy Lucas was also visited by Ron Lax. And
were those shoes muddy?
Out. Yeah, they were. Anyway, we probably talked enough.
I agree. And so, thank you for coming on. And we've had a fantastic talk as always. This case is the case that never goes away. I don't believe that we're going anywhere with it. We'll continue to cover it if there's any developments, but
we shall see.
At some point, this case will completely go away. And I think that's what Damien's trying to prevent, because this is his cash flow. Let's not forget, people, if Damien hadn't been convicted of these horrific murders, he would be a nobody still. And God knows what he'd be in prison for if he hadn't done, these things specific. And what I mean by that is he has made money off of murder of 3 little boys. And that is his whole life's flow. That is where he gets his money flow from. These 3 dead boys.
And he does nothing for free. He does nothing for free. But if you want to go hang out with him when he lives in New York, you could go hang out with him at the museum, for instance, for like $200 an hour or something. Yeah. I mean,
he's the Dalai Lama.
He'll do anything for money, but he's even said as much. He doesn't really want to deal with fans.
Right.
I mean, that's what a guy. What a guy.
He's a fantastic person.
Yeah. I know there was something I was going to say, but we already said plenty, so I'll just forget it.
Very good.
It'll pop up. It'll pop up again and again sometimes. Well, so anyway,
Gary, I appreciate you coming on. It was good talking to you as always. And I'm sure we'll do, I have some more stuff for us in the future if you're willing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. If nothing else happens with this case in 6 months, it might even be a short visit where we just laugh about how ridiculous this whole thing was. But I also want to do, hopefully starting it this year, probably be towards the end or this new coming year. I do want to do a documentary, and I do want you to be involved. And I've been kind of collecting information and just kind of thinking about how we are going to get this done. And I want it to happen. Right now I'm in the middle
of a documentary getting close. It'll probably be done around July or August for the case, the Karen Mitchell case. But the next one on my list is the West Memphis 3, the Forgotten Evidence, or something like along those lines.
Yeah, I would like to do that, and I want, without getting into personal details, that for number one, I just simply don't like to throw those out for the public to chew over because of the weirdos that are involved in this case. I've had stuff going on for a couple of months where I've been really very tied up with things, and I've got some new responsibilities that I'm also not going to get into, but good ones, but responsibilities. But, I'm sort of going to be freed up, hopefully, within the next month from some of the more nagging things that have been going on with me over the past 6 months or so, particularly the last 4 months.
Well, and, I'm looking forward to it, and it's something that we've talked about, and I think that it's something that needs to be done. Just okay. From my perspective, I'm passionate about
briefly. William Ramsey, who did some very good research on this, and his book is also Abomination is also a very good book on the case.
Yep.
He tried to do a documentary on this at one point and ran into all sorts of copyright problems, and he resorted to posting. He really had to just sort of feed it in little feeds on YouTube and so forth. What he accumulated at that time, but he had really tried to do some sort of documentary on this at some point and just couldn't. There was, he was meeting opposition right and left from all sorts of people. I'm sure. I don't know all the gory details, but it would be the first time somebody's actually done something along those lines. In this case, I did want to say one other thing. This case, as I said earlier, the Paradise Lost, before that, there really weren't these kind of crime documentaries for the most part. I'm not sure when Thin Blue Line came out, which was Errol Morris, about the Randall Adams case in Texas. Maybe it predated that, but Paradise Lost really has become a paradigmatic case for wrongful conviction. It's sort of like the oldie goldie of all time. I mean, as far as true crime, when they start doing the list of greatest crime documentaries ever, it always shows up somewhere on those lists. Anyway,
it is one of the biggest true crime stories. Like you said, it is the godfather of true crime, and because the way that it was done, Paradise Lost was talent. I always forget the guy's name, but he's talented nonetheless. I mean, he did. It is
Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky. I just watched. Berlinger has been doing a lot of crime type shows for Netflix.
Yeah,
I just watched a sort of moderately interesting miniseries. Like 3 or 4 episodes.
Was it the hotel one?
Oh, no, it was about the 42nd Street Killers. It's about a serial killer who was haunting Times Square back in, I think I'm not even sure when it was. I don't remember right now, but it was the 70s. So it was real interesting because of course, it was in the 70s. Times Square was very sleazy back then, and this guy was basically killing. He claims he killed like 80 women.
Oh, wow.
I'd never heard of the case before. It was sort of moderately interesting, but it was not anywhere near the class of Paradise
Well,
Law.
that's weird that he's making documentaries about people who he thinks are guilty of crimes.
Yeah, he did that thing on the hotel. He did a documentary on Ted Bundy for Netflix that, I mean, I've always say I'm not interested in true crime, but I was always interested in certain cases, including Ted Bundy.
Well,
and
he doesn't
that
count.
one wasn't.
Everybody likes him, or not likes him.
Everybody loves Ted. Everybody loves Ted, but anyway, it was a moderately interesting documentary, but I had a lot of problems with it because of the various things he does with recreations and so forth. It just bothers me. Mm-hmm. And then he did that movie with the heartthrob. I can't think of the boy's name, but with starring Ted Bundy, where it's all about his romance with Elizabeth Kimball, I think the woman's name was. And, that was sort of moderately interesting too, but he's done nothing in the same that's even, and of course he did that Metallica movie, which was not probably the second best thing he's done, except behind Paradise Lost. But, Sanofsky's dead. So, he's not going to see anything else from him. But Berlinger's staying busy.
And that was Zac Efron who played Bundy. Did a good job.
Yeah.
Not too bad at all.
Did a good job too. I'm not trying to take away from him. He did a good job, and it was very watchable, I thought.
Sure,
but
a talented guy.
But
He has an agenda. He had an agenda with this.
Yeah, well, he had an agenda, and I'm going to say this. I know I was going to shut up. Berlinger and Sanofsky really manipulated and mistreated the parents of these dead children with the way they put this movie together. They went in as if they were sympathetic. They won their trust, and they totally betrayed that trust, particularly in the opening minutes of Paradise Lost, where they show this. Really, I've seen it. I don't know how many times. It still makes me cringe to watch those boys on the bank, the bodies of those boys on the banks. I can't stand it. Makes me cringe thinking about it now. It's awful. But
it was very controversial to this day.
How do you think the poor parents
felt? It's awful.
Anyway.
They should have never done that.
No.
And I can't get that image. Honestly, when I think about Paradise Lost, that's one of the first images that comes to my mind. It's haunting.
Yeah, I wish I hadn't even mentioned it, because now it's rolling in my head. It's not something I like to think about. I had a son that was about that age at the time, and
mm-hmm.
I see my own kid in the faces of those kids, and it tears me up sometimes.
I hear you.
Anyway, I'll let you go.
It's very good. Thank you so much for being here, Gary, and we will talk soon as always.
Okay, bye-bye.
And that was Gary Meece. Gary, again, author of 3 books on the West Memphis 3. The case, Blood on Black, Where the Monsters Go, and the condensed version, The Case Against the West Memphis 3 Killers, all available on Amazon for digital and print. And I want to thank him again for his time. He's fantastic. He does his due diligence. And we don't have to agree on this case. It is one of those things that will forever be in our minds and be controversial to some people. That's fair enough. But consider the evidence. Take a look for yourself. Because you don't have to take my word for it. You don't have to take Gary's word for it. But it is there to read about. And like I said, we are in the information age. So there, in fact, we can research much more than a documentary allowed back in 93. Thank you so much for listening. I'm your host, Joshua Diaz, the Lab/NBD podcast. I'll catch you guys next time. Thank you.